Hello everyone, and welcome to the complete Warhammer Fantasy Iceberg. When I started this video, I planned to release just another part, one level deeper into this iceberg I found online. However, after the success of the Fallout Vaults series, I thought you guys might enjoy more long-form content. So I decided to combine parts 1, 2, and 3, splicing the intros and outros out, and just go ahead and finish the rest of the Iceberg series, for you to enjoy in one easy to consume package. For everyone that's new and coming from the Fallout Vaults video, hi! I hope you like Warhammer. This Iceberg series was the first videos I made on this channel, so the earlier entries are going to have worse microphone quality, generally just cringy memes, but stick it out, I promise it gets better. Slightly. Please also stick around to the end. I have some questions for you guys about the future content you would like to see on this channel. So let's get right into it with our first entry.
Holy Sigma, bless this ravaged body!
The first entry is a well-known theory stating that the Warhammer fantasy world is just another planet in the 40k universe, and the wider Imperium just doesn't care about it. The theory essentially says the High, Dark, and Wood Elves are just Exodite Eldar, and the Orcs are just crash-landed feral Orcs. Also, both universes have similar gods, including the 4 Chaos gods and their named demonic characters such as Be'lakor, Skarbrand, and Kugath. The gods Canon and Isha are shared between the Warhammer Fantasy Elves and 40k Eldar, showing even more ties to the setting. There have also been minor references in fantasy heavily hinting at this theory, such as when a group of Skaven looting the Lizardman Temple came across this device, that when activated, they heard someone speaking through the device in a language that sounded similar to the High Elves, implying it to be Eldar. In the book The End Times Kane, a wood elf named Araloth is assisted by an unusually large knight in gleaming silver armor and shooting fire from his hands, so either a random Grey Knight or Kaldor Drago himself.
You will fall! You will not bring humanity down! God is going to destroy you!
Further down this iceberg, there is another specific example of Warhammer Fantasy sorta straight up combining the two settings. Pretty openly, actually.
Orcs? Here? I didn't even realize they could talk, let alone reason.
This is an entry just kinda hidden in plain sight. Dwarves in Warhammer Fantasy are very heavy on family clans and kinship, similar to traditional Scottish culture and medieval Scottish politics. With Halflings, I don't really get what this entry is trying to tell me. They do drink huge amounts of alcohol and eat a lot, which is more of a stereotype than anything. But to me, and anyone who thinks for a few seconds, Halflings are just knockoffs of J.R.R. Tolkien's hobbits. Their homeland of the Moot is described as rolling hills, as Halflings enjoy a simple, rural, and quiet life. I mean, that's probably the most copy and pasted bit of lore Games Workshop has stolen.
Dang! What's up with all these books?
The Liber Chaotica is a series of books written by the in-universe character of Richter Kless, who is a Sigmarite priest tasked with studying the nature of chaos, and just like anyone who tries to fuck with chaos, he went a little crazy. He eventually starts having nightmares and visions of just straight up Chaos Space Marines and Abaddon's Black Crusades.
I'm being serious. No, you see, I'm talking facts here. I don't do if, buts and maybes. I do absolutes. And, you know, like, if your aunt had balls, she'd be your uncle. But she doesn't, so she's not. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I don't know what this is exactly talking about. Warhammer Fantasy takes inspiration from cultures around the world. This could be talking about the fact that the Empire of Man, while being based on the Holy Roman Empire, also has a large imperial navy and colonies around the world, kind of like the British Empire. Albion is supposed to be the British Isles that are inhabited by a culture heavily centered around druidic magic, and even having standing stone circles that are points of strong magic. It is described as a wet, gloomy, and foggy land, so just England. Besides that, I couldn't find any specific references to things like fish and chips, so if you know any, please leave them in the comments below.
Embrace the dwarf pal!
This entry should tell you how old this iceberg is. Yeah, there are Chaos Dwarves. They live in the Darklands, using mostly slave labor as their workforce, and can actually use sorcery unlike their uncorrupted kin. They have been around for a long time, but rarely used by Games Workshop. Their last book was from 5th edition, but did get some rules for 8th edition in Tamukan Throne of Chaos campaign book. Recently, a huge spotlight was put on them after the release of Total War Warhammer 3's Chaos Dwarves DLC, so they're not really a secret anymore. They never had a huge impact on the world and was barely an army with only a handful of kits for the tabletop. In the end times, Grimgor came out of nowhere and just chokeslammed them all.
Time to celebrate Great Horned Rat Day by eating the dead corpses of all the non-existent Chaos Gods!
I could do a whole video on Malal, but he's been talked about to death. Malal was supposed to be the 5th Chaos God that briefly appeared in the late 1980s. He is probably my favorite Chaos God, as he is the Chaos God of, well, hating chaos, really. That's right, he was a Chaos God who represented all the hate and want to destroy chaos. His followers are depicted as mostly fighting the other 4 main Chaos factions. Malal, being a Chaos God, is supposedly in both settings, but he is in copyright hell since his first appearance.
Just you wait, I will become relevant again!
Malal, just stop.
Since then, he has not made any official resurfaces, but I really wish he would.
These are demons. It's basically an intergalactic invasion into this space through people.
The original Realm of Chaos books were 2 supplement books that focused on the 4 Chaos Gods and fleshed out their lore quite heavily. Slaves to Darkness was released in 1988 and gave background lore to Khorne, the god of murder, and Slaanesh, the god of pleasure. The book gave rules to creating your own Chaos Champion with rewards, tiers, as well as weapons, armor, and mutations you can equip on them. It is also the first Warhammer book to feature the first complete narrative of the Horus Heresy. What? Yeah, right there. A book mostly focusing on Warhammer Fantasy was the first complete narrative for the Horus Heresy. Huh. The Lost and the Damned was released in 1990 and focused on Nurgle, the god of disease, and Tzeentch, the god of magic. They did have reprints of this book while I was at Warhammer World once, and I regret not buying it.
What do I do, Lord?
Destroy the child. Corrupt them all.
This is their plan, people. These are demons.
If you're interested in a more in-depth look at these 2 classic books, I'll leave a link in the description for Snipe and Wib. They got their hands on the original books and do a very good job going through both.
Alright, listen to me, you knife-eared piece of shit!
Mithril armor is a light silver metal that only weighs about 20% of what a normal metal armor would weigh. It is supposedly not magical, but you can only forge it and shape it using magical means. The problem with Mithril is that it's the same name given to armor in Lord of the Rings, so it's probably not considered canon anymore. The last mention of it was in the 6th edition core rulebook that came out in 2000. It stated that High Elf armies wore Mithril armor, but that was the last mention of it.
It is all pointless. There is only a short time left.
Back in the good old days of 1970s, a young Games Workshop got the licensing rights to distribute Dungeons & Dragons products in the UK, which eventually grew large enough to start their own miniature production company, Citadel. In 1986, Games Workshop shifted to focusing on Warhammer Fantasy Battle and 40,000 after a change in leadership in the company. I couldn't find anything about this being a desperate move to get rid of stock overflow, but rather just focusing on a more lucrative and profitable game system that they owned.
It's wizard time, motherfucker! Fireball!
The only thing I could find about this was from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st Edition, in the Magic Rules on page 132, right there. You see it? No? Alright, zoom in. And there we go. We can clearly see that there are rules for wizard dwarves and halflings. But we only care about the dwarves right now.
That's it again, was it?
So yeah, these days dwarves can use runic magic, which is kind of the same, but at the same not. But right there it clearly says dwarf wizard. And the rules go on to describe how to become a wizard and the progression of a wizard's career.
That's 3, 4, 5 hits. Okay, I'm gonna roll my saving throw, which is 3+.
What in the actual f*** are you guys doing?
Warmaster is the Warhammer Fantasy, as Legion's Titanicus is the Warhammer 40k. As in, it's a whole different system using smaller but more models per unit to simulate much larger battles in the Warhammer Fantasy setting. The system used 10 to 12 millimeter minis. The original release first appeared in 2000, with an online supplement appearing in 2006, adding in your typical armies such as Dark Elves, Skaven, Vampires, but also armies that never saw any real release in the normal tabletop game, like Kislev and Araby. Before that, however, in 2005, Games Workshop released 2 spin-off games under the Warmaster banner, called Warmaster Battle for the Five Kingdoms, a Lord of the Rings tabletop game, and Warmaster Ancients, that simulated battles from early biblical periods to 1066 CE. We'll get back to that one. Games Workshop quit producing products for Warmaster in 2013. I do wonder what they had planned for Fantasy in 2014. Must have been good. Today, Warmaster has a dedicated online community creating and updating their own rules and releases. I'll link a video to the Warmaster podcast. They did a great video on a game between ogres and tomb kings.
On second thoughts, let's not go to Camelot. It is a silly place.
This is an extra entry I decided to add myself. While doing research for Warmaster, I ran into Warmaster Ancients, and after doing some more digging, I discovered Warhammer Historical, a publishing wing for Games Workshop that produced minis and rules for historical war games. They had all sorts of game systems, such as the aforementioned Warhammer Ancients focused on ancient warfare, to the English Civil War and up to the Great War. Supposedly, from a leaked email, it was discovered Warhammer Historical fell under the umbrella of Forge World in 2010, finally being fully shut down 2 years later in 2012. Half-Orks were a race only ever mentioned in the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game. They are either half-orc, half-human hybrids, or a different kind of goblin or hobgoblin that inhabited the eastern steppes, a vast land north of Cathay, aka Fantasy Mongolia. Just like their full-blooded cousins, they are a mean, violent race that regularly turns to banditry and thievery, and on occasion hired as mercenaries. Of course, this all comes from Warhammer Fantasy role-playing, and a majority of the lore there has weird non-canon tidbits like dwarf wizards, so it's safe to say that these guys are not canon.
Something your eyes just can't believe. In Korean, that word is and it's like wow, but more.
However, in a Warhammer community post on the 22nd of July 2021, while talking about the upcoming Warhammer Fantasy reboot The Old World, Games Workshop added this line. Clearly, at this time, Kislev was a vast empire indeed, its territories encompassing lands said by some to be haunted by hobgoblins, centaurs, and half-orcs. I almost wrote these guys off as non-canon. You gotta hang that little nugget in front of me.
Do what you want, cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate.
I'm going to assume this is talking about the tabletop game and not the shitty PC game. Man of War is an old, out-of-print spin-off game featuring naval warfare in the Warhammer setting. Originally published in 1993, Man of War was a sort of pet project for a game designer for Games Workshop, Nigel Steelman, who wrote several army books for 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition. The game featured navies from the Empire, Bretonnia, Dwarves, Orcs, as well as the High and Dark Elves. Later on, expansions of Man of War in the form of Plague Fleet was released, which expanded on the rules for Chaos, Skaven, and even Chaos Dwarves. Sea of Blood was the final expansion, which added flying units as well as Norska and a neutral sea monsters unit that could be added to any fleet as allies regardless of faction. Man of War must not have done so well as it was discontinued 2 years after launch in 1995, but Games Workshop is notoriously for randomly dropping support for the spin-off game, so it's really hard to say.
Captain!
Yeah?
If you are interested, I will leave a link below for Crown and Command Games, who did a very entertaining battle report for Man of War featuring the Empire versus Chaos.
I am the Pirate King.
Oh boy. Dreadfleet was Games Workshop's attempt to sort of Frankenstein Man of War back from the dead, possibly for a quick buck from fans of the original Man of War. Instead of having multiple navies battle it out on the high seas, Dreadfleet came with only 2 fleets. On the evil side, you got Count Noculus piloting the Bloody Reaver, a Tomb King ship with a pyramid on top because they really want you to know that these guys are undead Egyptians, a ghost ship levitating over the water, an undead sea monster somehow piloted by the Skaven, and a mechanical Chaos Dwarf Kraken. Badass. On the other side, you had an Empire flagship, a High Elf ship, a Dwarf submarine, an Araby ship captained by a genie, and a pirate ship captained by Aranessa's Saltspite. Yes, that Aranessa's Saltspite, the one legendary lord nobody cares about.
Because right now, I just don't recommend even playing her. I'd give Aranessa a complete miss. It is not a fun campaign. It's just boring. On all difficulties, in my opinion.
Just like Man of War, the gameplay mostly consists of rolling dice to shoot and board your opponent's ships. However, there is a card system to it that adds a bit of randomness to every game, which was one of the most complained about systems in this game, as there will be times where you pull a fate card before the game even begins and just sort of blow up your own ship, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right. That is what's up here. 1-3.
So 1-3.
Uh-oh.
Any Dreadfleet warship within 18 inches of the small skull next to the
Oh,
marker.
that's both of mine, I think.
Yeah.
Oh.
Must draw damage cards until a hull damage
card. What the fuck? We've only got 3 hull points. And we've barely started.
Here we go.
Hull damage. So both my ships are 1/3 dead before the game begins. And what happens to the wind?
And the wind is now over here, blowing at a wind speed of 6.
It's all the way over there?
Yeah.
The Yogscast did a mini-series on the game, as well as Angry Joe, who did a much better job at explaining the rules, playing a full game, and giving their thoughts and opinions on the game itself. Araby is a human civilization along the northern coast of the Southlands. Wow, say that 5 times fast. Quite obviously, they are a fantastical representation and mixture of the Arabic, Turkish, and North African cultures in the Warhammer fantasy setting. They are a very mercantile people, with trade routes all over the world. Their cities are extravagant and very wealthy, with markets bustling with customers. If you want an exotic product, then Araby's markets are where you'll find it. So, a quick summary of magic. All magic users get their powers from chaos and manifest it in the physical realm. And in the Warhammer setting, there are 2 massive fuck-off portals to the Chaos Realms on the north and south poles. The closer you are to these poles, the stronger your magic will be. Araby, being situated along the equator, isn't really close to either, so magic users are harder to come by, but that doesn't mean there are none. In fact, there are a special type of creature called a jinn, or genie. These genies are theorized to be a type of demon, and the common people of Araby sometimes worship them as a sort of god or spirit. However, they are not all powerful, as skilled sorcerers are able to lock genies in magical cages, boxes, and even crystals. Yeah, we're getting into some real Aladdin shit here. Never said Games Workshop was original.
Today's subject, slavery.
Yeah, if we're going to talk about Araby, we're going to have to talk about their slave trade. Araby imports and exports slaves from all over the world. They do this so much and so effectively that the city of Lashik is called the slave capital of the world. Think about that for a second. Your slave economy is so large that you're considered the slave capital of the world, while a civilization like the Dark Elves exist, whose entire society, economy, and sacrificial rituals are reliant on slaves. They are such prolific slavers that they travel all the way to Norska and trade with the Norskins in order to buy large shipments of slaves to bring back to Araby.
Look at this dude. Wait till you see the... No, 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 no.
There is nothing about this I understand.
Wow, talk about a vague entry. Obviously, I'm not the author of this Iceberg, so I can't know for sure what this entry is talking about. However, I did find a few books I wanted to talk about. Ravening Hordes was released in 1987 for the 2nd edition. It contains special rules as well as a set of army lists. These army lists includes the Empire, Dwarves, Dark Elves, Chaos, Undead, Orcs, just Elves, Skaven, followed by Norska, and then Nippon. Yeah, that Nippon, the fantasy Japan that only has like a paragraph of lore. A year later, in 1988, Warhammer Siege was released, a 140-page rulebook all about siege warfare and how to have siege battles in the Warhammer fantasy setting. The rules explained how to set up a castle, movement and combat within the castle, but also some interesting rules like fires breaking out within the fort as well as foraging and supplies in your castle, and mechanics for siege towers, battering rams, and other siege equipment. And lastly, we have the Realm of Chaos books that I covered in last episode. Just go watch that. I'm not sure how obscure these are, but I think these were the most interesting.
Warman, der cowards,
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
The Famir are a Cyclops swamp-dwelling creature that used to be the primary worshippers and favored race of Chaos. That is, until the Chaos Gods became more interested in humankind. They still exist, but Beastmen are treated better by Games Workshop and are really low on the Chaos totem pole. They mostly inhabit the bogs and swamps of the wasteland, north-ish of Marienburg, and use magic to shroud the primitive fortresses in a thick fog that not even the sun can pierce the clouds. Also, they supposedly have the knowledge on how to summon and control any demon they want, but this isn't confirmed. The Famir never had much of an impact on the setting, mostly just hiding in their swamp fortresses, sometimes raiding Empire settlements alongside Norscan raiders. They were mentioned all the way up until 8th edition, and once during the start of Age of Sigmar, even getting a Forge World model and rules. Whether they are still canon in AOS, I can't really say. In the early 90s, Games Workshop had a record labeled called Warhammer Records. Original, right? With only one band under them called D-Rock. Who was a British rock band in 1991. The band released its only album called Oblivion, featuring a Space Marine from the Space Marine chapter of, let's go with the Black Templars. Interestingly, the lead guitarist Brian May of Queen, yes, that Queen, who played in 2 of the songs on the record called Get Out of My Way and Red Planet Blues. This is not the first time GW dipped their toes into the music industry. They collaborated with death metal band Bolt Thrower and released an album called Realm of Chaos, but it was released under Earache Records. It's, interesting. Alright, enough of that.
I have the power of God and anime on my side! Wait,
When talking about minor chaos gods, Malal is always the first to be brought up. But there are many minor chaos gods in both fantasy and the 40k setting. These 2 are one of those gods, but seem to be only regulated to the Warhammer fantasy setting. Let's start with Necoho. I hope I'm saying that right. Necoho is the god of not believing in gods. No, really, he's the ultimate R-atheism user. So the way it works in Warhammer, if you have a large group of people believe in something really hard, that thing will manifest as maybe not a god, but as some sort of entity. The more people who believe in this thing, the more powerful that entity becomes. So what happens if you have a lot of people who really don't believe in any of the gods? You create the god of unbelief. Necoho shouldn't exist. He is the entity that not only hates religion and gods, but actively does not think they exist while being a god himself. Because of this, Necoho has a very small following and sometimes seems like he doesn't even want them around. He hardly ever directly manifests to his followers, but when he does, he takes the shape of an ordinary and honestly fucking creepy old man. Bolgasgrad is the only city in the Warhammer world where he is actively worshipped, much to his dismay. These names. Zuvassin is like the ultimate troller. He is the chaos god of making sure plans go wrong. If you have plans to kill the emperor and take over the empire yourself, Zuvassin is there to make sure your plot is revealed. If you are a Norscan raider planning to sail south to raid the coastline, Zuvassin is there to make sure you're caught in a storm and drown. He will even take over cults that think they've been worshipping another god, just to reveal to them that they've been worshipping him this whole time. Just for laughs, I guess. When he manifests to his followers, it's usually as the thing they fear the most, or as the same race as whoever he is talking to, but horribly disfigured. Either way, he is always laughing. Both of these gods come from a page of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition, so again, it's not 100% confirmed if these gods still exist or not, but honestly, I don't see why they can't.
You're the king? Well, I didn't vote for you.
There's really not much to expand on here. Early in the development of the very successful World of Warcraft RTS, it originally wasn't supposed to be a Warcraft game at all. Instead, it was a Warhammer Fantasy RTS. A producer of Warcraft, Patrick Wyatt, explained in an interview that the team behind the development of Warcraft 1 wanted to make a Warhammer RTS, but according to Blizzard co-founder Alan Adam, whatever. They failed to secure a license with Games Workshop. Because of this inspiration, rumors were spreading that Blizzard ripped off Games Workshop's IP. Since there was no legal battle over this, I think that says all we need to know.
Objection!
While editing this, I came across this quote by Patrick Wyatt, who said his dad saw a Tomb King skeleton chariot in a store and told Wyatt he thought this company was trying to rip off Wyatt's Warcraft game. Which, of course, the Tomb King chariot is from Games Workshop, which is what Patrick was basing his game off of. So, after doing some digging, I think I undersold just how similar these two settings were at the time. Just thought I would throw that in there. Okay, that's it. Back to it then. This was back in the day when Games Workshop was very stingy with handing out their license to third-party producers. Unlike today, when it seems like every week there's a new shitty mobile game. A little off topic, there eventually was a Warhammer Fantasy RTS released in 2006 called Warhammer Mark of Chaos, and it's this game where we get badass trailers like this. Or this. Looking at the gameplay, it looks eerily similar to what would eventually follow Total War Warhammer in 2016.
Listen here, you pansy elf. I hate elves, hate goblins, hate orcs. Love me axe, love me gold, and I love me mountain. Simple as.
Ugh, as if we didn't have enough elves already. Look, to be fair, for the life of me I could not find any night elves, but there is a surprising amount of lore on Sea Elves. But like most elf lore in any fantasy setting, it's not that interesting. Sea Elves are names given to high elves who spend most of their lives out on sea, either as traders or in the Aesir Navy. These Sea Elves will sometimes even live in large trading cities like Marienburg, which has a whole district run by high elves called, and I kid you not, Elf Town. After the War of the Beard, a huge lore subject I would like to cover one day, the High Elves abandoned most of their colonies they set up in the Old World. A few centuries later, humanity began establishing kingdoms across the Old World and setting up their own cities within the ruins of old High Elf colonies. The Sea Elves were instrumental in establishing trade routes with these new kingdoms, allowing trade to flourish between human, elves, and dwarves once again after the War of the Beard that left both the Dwarf and High Elf Empire a shadow of its former self. Once again, I could not find anything that mentioned Night Elves. Every time I think I find a lead, it just leads me back to the Dark Elves, which, thank God, we don't need any more types of elves.
Are you a god? Are you a god? Are you a god?
Shut up, bro! Damn! This dude ever stop talking?
I feel like this entry is beating a dead horse at this point. We already talked about 3 different Chaos Gods in the last 2 tiers, that being Malal, Necoho, and Zuvassin. And if you want to get technical, all gods in Warhammer are Chaos Gods, minus the Dragon siblings and Dragon Emperor and Cathay, which, are they gods? Was that ever confirmed? Anyways, I went digging and found this interesting fella, the Screaming Godchild, a twisted freak that takes the form of a young child with no facial features, minus a mouth. Creepy. This all comes from a comic book following the Dark Elf Malus Darkblade and his adventures across the Chaos Wastes. The Screaming Godchild is being held prisoner in a Chaos Palace, guarded by what seem like the greater demons of the 4 major Chaos Gods to keep the child in. Why the Chaos Gods had this entity locked away, seemingly afraid of him, none can say. But fuck that, I have an idea. Throughout the comic, we constantly see the Godchild rocking the 8-pointed star of Chaos that represents Chaos Undivided, a sect of Chaos worship that worships all 4 Chaos Gods as a pantheon. My tinfoil hat theory is that this worship of Chaos Undivided is accidentally creating a new Chaos God that is the combination of all 4 major Chaos Gods into one being. Of course, I'm talking about the Screaming Godchild. And that's why the other 4 gods are banding together to keep this child locked away. Because if it got out, it could perhaps become powerful enough to replace them all. Of course, that's just a theory.
A game theory. Thanks for watching.
Oh, and the reason it's called the Screaming Godchild is because in the comic it tells Malus that it just has the tendency to scream. So yeah, real mysterious dude. To say Coatl. Coach. I don't like that. It's just going to be Coatl. Coatls are rare creatures found in Lustria that basically are giant snakes with wings. Despite being an animal, they can manipulate the winds of magic and are worshipped as messengers or avatars of Teapot, a god for the skinks. Skink priests will gather the feathers of Coatls and weave a magical cape from the feathers called a cloak of feathers, which hilariously gives the skinks the ability to fly. Powerful skink priests can form a bond with Coatls and even ride them into battle. In older lore, specifically 2nd edition, Coatls are depicted as intelligent beings with their own language. This contradicts the representation we get in later editions that treat them as simple creatures that are worshipped by the skinks. Also, I found in the old lore, the Slann referred to Coatls as avatars of Quetzalcoatl, a god that existed in very old lore and was revered by the Slann and possibly other lizardmen, which Quetzalcoatl is just straight up the name of a real-life Aztec god, who is also depicted as a winged feathered serpent. Keep this in mind, as Aztec gods will show up later in this Iceberg series.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Continuing this strange creatures section, we have the Zoats. The Zoats are creatures full of mystery. Nobody knows where they came from, what they're doing, what their goals are, or even how they got to the old world in the first place. It is theorized in-universe that they are a type of lizardman, but if that's true, why are they not in Lustria? Furthermore, they are all-powerful wizards, and they are just kind of born with these powers instead of acquiring them through studying magic. Mostly inhabiting the deep woods of the old world, it's hard to come across one, and even when their homeland is invaded, they prefer guerrilla-like tactics, setting up traps for an invading force instead of hitting them head-on. In 3rd edition, in-universe scholars began to theorize that their numbers are dwindling and soon could become extinct. Interestingly, they are also in Warhammer 40k. In the beginning, they were enslaved by the Tyranid hive mind and served as diplomats for a species hell-bent on consuming the entire galaxy. I'm not sure why the Tyranids would need diplomats for that, but okay. Like I said, this was in early lore, and the Zoats did make a return with the Blackstone Fortress expansion and even retconned this lore in a Warhammer community post that announced the expansion. The post stated that they were theorized to be a Tyranid bioform by in-universe scientists, but state that they were wrong and are intelligent creatures, just like their fantasy counterpart, are completely mysterious and no one knows what they want. Also, what a badass model, just thought I would throw that out there.
It's so boring.
BattleMasters was a standalone board game created by the Milton Bradley Company in collaboration with Games Workshop in 1992. It's a board game that simulates battles that you would see with Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but with much simpler rules and easier to set up and get started. The game came with everything you needed, including a human empire and an evil army that had a combination of Chaos Warriors, Orcs, and Ogres. The way the game worked is players would take turns drawing cards from a deck, and on those cards would feature one of your units, and it told you what you could do: move, attack, charge, and so on. The models were not the highest quality compared to today, but it was an easy to set up out of the box board game. Also, back in the day, you could use these models in your Warhammer Fantasy army if you wanted to. Later on, 2 expansions were released. Both were a sort of reinforcement box that gave you extra units to use for both armies. The reception was okay. One reviewer from the magazine Dragon praised the amount of pieces you get in the box, but criticized the gameplay itself, stating that every unit feels the same and there is no real difference between, say, a spearman unit and a beastman unit. A French magazine called Casus Belli, thank you EU4 for teaching me that word, stated essentially the same thing. Lots of good quality game pieces, but too simplified of a game system. Funny enough, 30 years later, that is 3 years later, a designer named Stephen Baker did an interview with Toy and Tea blog stating that the reviewers were just wrong and that there is a lot of strategic depth in the game. He said another designer of the game also said the game was too luck driven and then bragged that he won 14 out of 14 games with the same designer. Which, okay, I haven't played the game, I don't know what I'm talking about, but if the game truly is about luck like these 2 reviewers and your own designer said, then yes, you winning 14 out of 14 games is possible solely on luck, because that's just how statistics work. I think my man just needs to move on. Okay, just like the obscure 2nd and 3rd edition books and the British culture references in the earlier entries, I have no idea what this is talking about. I couldn't find any references to real-life musical artists like Mozart or something. But I don't want to leave you guys with nothing, so I went digging for some obscure lore related to music. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, Paths of the Damned, I did find lore about a Royal College of Music situated in Middenheim, the capital of Middenland. It's an extravagant university that holds spectacular shows for the city's elites during festivals and holidays. Despite being an institute for rich, snobby elites, the college performs charity shows to raise money for the city's poor population, refugees, widows, and orphans, as well as raise money for the reconstruction of damaged and destroyed buildings after a war.
Potatoes. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew.
We talked about the Halflings in the first episode of the series, but did you know that Halflings got a few of their own units? And by a few, I mean only 2 that I could find at least. First is a basic archer unit that was a regiment of renown. This regiment took part in the Halfling rebellion against Averlin, who was hell-bent on wiping the Halflings out of the moat completely. The second unit was an artillery piece that was literally 3 cooks slinging kettles of boiling liquid into enemy lines. That's it. Just so I can pad out this video longer, you can find an 84-page army book online made for the fan-made 9th edition that came out as a result of the end times. It's completely free, full of art and rules, and you should check it out.
Shall not pass!
In this next edition of Games Workshop ripping off Lord of the Rings, we have the Balrog. That's it. It's just a Balrog. Same concept. Flaming whip and all. It is considered a greater demon, but for which god it doesn't say. Of course, this comes from really early lore, so after the Bloodthirster came around, which is also kind of a Balrog, the Balrog was never mentioned again.
Stop! You violated the law. Pay the court a fine or serve your sentence. Your stolen goods are now forfeit.
It is Wednesday, my dudes.
The Lizardmen have gone through a lot of retcons throughout the total length of Warhammer Fantasy. Originally, the Slann used to have their own army of just frogs. Just like modern Lizardmen, they were heavily based on Mesoamerican cultures. They also worshipped their own gods like Quetzalcoatl, which was mentioned in the Coatl entry. Most of these gods were either renamed Aztec gods or just straight up the same name. They also had a sizable human slave population they used as cannon fodder. Later, Games Workshop combined the Lizardmen and Slann into one faction, making the Fat Frogs into the ruling priest class that are directly created by the Old Ones to help terraform the world into their perfect image.
It sounds like a dog toy. But actually, this is the sonorous war cry of a very angry frog.
This was before Chaos invaded and the Old Ones fucked off into their spaceships. Eventually, in the end times, Chaos invaded again, and this time the Slann fucked off into space, making them technically the only surviving race from the original Warhammer Fantasy setting.
You know my name? William Knifeman.
In the early days of 2nd edition, before the Centaurs of the Beastmen, there were just regular Centaurs. They were an intelligent nomadic-like society living in the steppes north of the mountains of Morn. They lived by herding and hunting bison and deer. They do have a stat line from 2nd edition rulebook, but no models were ever released, none that I could find anyway. They were quietly removed from the lore, probably to make the Beastmen Centaurs more unique, but besides them being semi-nomadic and hunting bison, which I guess bison are canon too, there's nothing that really screams Native American culture, which I think can open up a dialogue about adding a Native North American inspired faction into any fantasy setting really. Think about it. How many settings do you know that have a sizable and important faction based on North American nations? We already have a Mesoamerican faction in Warhammer Fantasy, so why not North American?
Do you hear the voices too?
The Realm of Chaos books mostly focus on the big four chaos gods, Nurgle, Khorne, Tzeentch, and YouTube age restriction. However, there is a section in these books on creating minor chaos entities, including some pre-made demons you can use that serves them, as well as a large table that allows you to roll for random traits your god might have. If that's not enough, the book just tells you to make stuff up in order to fit the narrative you're trying to create for your god. Now I keep saying god, and that's not entirely accurate. This section mentions not just other gods but lesser entities, and even independent demons. Think of Be'lakor. He's not exactly tied down to any one god, and sort of does his own thing.
Receiver coach has been blown away by Crabtree's hands and his ability to suck in these balls.
Kerrunch, released by Games Workshop in 1991, was essentially a simplified and faster version of Blood Bowl. The original Blood Bowl, launched in 1986, had a lot of complex rules which could be daunting for new or younger players. To make the game more accessible and to attract a wider audience, especially younger players, Kerrunch was introduced as an easy-to-understand all-in-one box set. Just like how BattleMasters served as a more approachable version of Warhammer Fantasy, Kerrunch aimed to streamline Blood Bowl's gameplay while maintaining its core spirit of fantasy American football, because even GW knows soccer is way too boring for a fantasy setting. In the box, you get 4 teams, one of orcs, elves, dwarves, and humans, each playing slightly different. By most accounts, it was received okay-ish, receiving a 5.7 on Board Game Geeks. A lot of issues come from the fact that the teams being different is nice and all, but they're just not that well balanced.
Having the teams be different is nice, but they don't particularly feel well balanced.
Maybe it's just the games we've played, but the dwarves seem to really outclass everything else on the pitch.
Margaret Thatcher's dead. Ding dong, the wicked bitch is dead. It's a shame the bitch didn't die 87 years ago.
I almost didn't believe this was real until I started researching it. Now for a little history lesson. In 1984 to 1985, there was a major strike led by coal miners within the United Kingdom. This strike was to prevent the closure of mines that were deemed uneconomic in the eyes of the National Coal Board, aka the government, as these mines were nationalized in 1947.
That means the government owns them.
During this time, the Conservative Party, also known as the Tories, was in power, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who wanted to 1. Close coal mines and begin importing coal instead of mining it themselves, and 2. Also gut the power of trade unions not only in the coal mines but across the country. Thatcher went as far as to call the miners enemies in her now infamous The Enemy Within speech, where she compared the strikes to the Falkland Wars. In 1985, the strike was declared illegal and several miners returned to work after union pay ran out. This crippled trade unions in the UK forever. In 1980, around 55% of workers were part of a trade union, and now today only 23% of workers are unionized. Now with that context out of the way, back to Warhammer, the more important thing. In the fantasy roleplay supplement The Enemy Within, released in 1986, see where this is going? This could be a reference to Thatcher's infamous speech, but considering The Enemy Within is a pretty common phrase, I can't say it's 100% a reference, but I'm choosing to believe it. What's harder to dispute is the narrative campaign The Tragedy of Macbeth, released for Warhammer Fantasy Battle 3rd Edition. While the title is a tongue-in-cheek reference to Shakespeare's Macbeth, the third scenario in the book, called the Battle of Dungle Hill, is a reference to the strikes. In the scenario, the tyrant known as Macbeth sends forces led by Ian McGregor to destroy a mine being defended by dwarven miners. Now, Ian McGregor sounds oddly familiar to Ian McGregor, who was the head of the National Coal Board and was personally approved by Thatcher. Basically, he was the one shutting down the coal mines in the UK. So in this scenario, we have Ian McGregor leading an army to break resistance put up by dwarf miners. I mean, the only way they could make it more obvious is if they painted Thatcher's face on an orc banner or something.
Oh my goodness!
Your gum should be here by the end of the week.
My dick at? Where? Hey!
Eunuchs, both in Warhammer Fantasy and in real life history, tend to be male slaves that act as servants or even serve in the military, and most of the time castrated. Famously, in Chinese history, eunuchs had a lot of power in court, or at least more than most eunuchs around the world. And during the Civil War, known as the Three Kingdoms period, they are portrayed as corrupt and kind of the reason the Civil War even started in the first place. It's hard to say, as Chinese myth and Chinese history are hard to distinguish sometimes, and the Three Kingdoms period may have been entirely mythical. But looking back at Warhammer Fantasy, several nations utilized eunuch servants. Obviously, Araby, being the slave capital of the world, utilized a lot of them as warriors within their military, Game of Thrones style. In the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition, Knights Dark Masters, a Tilean explorer named Marco Polaire wrote of immortal eunuch wizards that drink the souls of men. However, these may just be vampires. Before Sigmar was born and united the human tribes into the empire as we know it today, the Azaborn tribe, which was a warrior-like culture, inhabited what is now known as Stirland. They had a large amount of women warriors who would roam the areas, capturing men, castrating, and enslaving them. In Skaven society, rat wives are a type of eunuch that caters to the various rat mothers, who are the only known female Skaven that are used entirely for birthing other Skaven. These rat mothers are mostly crippled from being constantly pregnant and being fed nothing but warpstone.
Here's what's really funny. Your mother. So I guess you could say your mother. Stop acting like you know the way ahead, like you know the rules. There are no rules, man. We're lost.
I'm not really sure what to do with this one. GW likes to put free downloadable rules online all the time. Sometimes it's core rule changes to new sub-factions to just rules you can use in narrative campaigns. So it's safe to assume that there are a lot of missing rules released over the years that never got backed up anywhere.
I took your advice. From now on, I'm normal.
In Warhammer Fantasy 1st Edition, there was no real lore. Nothing like we see today, and it mostly reads like another tabletop RPG. But jumping over to 2nd Edition, specifically the Ravening Horde supplement, we see factions that we would recognize today. Dark Elves, Skaven, Undead, the Empire, but actually sitting down and reading the lore, it seems bland. Let's take Norska for example. In this book, they're not the cannibalistic, crazy, chaos-worshipping, no-shirt-wearing freaks we see them in modern Warhammer. No, they're just Vikings, wearing actual armor and even writing poetry.
Loser! You're a loser! Are you feeling sorry for yourself? Well, you should be, because you are dirt!
In modern Warhammer, I'm not sure these people even know how to farm, let alone write. Looking at Nippon, it's just 15th century samurai with peasant levies like how real Japanese armies fought, with a few exceptions like wizards. The Empire is kind of the same as well, with Landsknecht inspired units, various knightly orders, warrior priests, and lots of gunpowder.
Enough about women's rights! It's time to talk about women's wrongs!
Deep in the Lustria jungle, you'll find death in many forms. Despite the continent being controlled by the Lizardman Empire, there are various other intelligent beings that call Lustria home. One such group are the tribeswomen of the Amazons. The Amazons are a group of tribeswomen who center their society around a fierce warrior culture. They've been around since the time of the Old Ones, when they landed on the planet and tried to create a paradise. Even back then, the Amazons created an independent kingdom, and the Old Ones in Slann simply accepted them. While the Slann regarded normal humans as inferior to themselves and better off as slaves, the Slann kind of respected the Amazons, establishing fruitful trade relations between them. During the Great Catastrophe, the Old One's warp gates located on both the north and south poles of the planet collapsed and a huge surge of chaos energy swept the planet, followed by an invasion of chaos demons. This event caused the Old Ones to pack up and leave the planet, and the Amazonian kingdom was broken, leaving them to hide within the Lustrian jungle with small safe havens for them to hide in. The Amazons also have their own pantheon. In their creation myth, the goddess Rig and the elven god Amyx had a child they called Khalim, the mother of all Amazons, suggesting that all Amazonian women are descendants of the gods themselves. However, it's more likely that they are normal humans who had their biology fucked with by the Old Ones while they were still around. Looking at their biology, they are almost identical to humans and can reproduce, normally, but also asexually, by simply giving birth to a genetically identical female child. What the fuck am I actually reading? Others say that they do this through alchemy. Tillian Captain and Explorer Juan Corneto says the process of reproduction is strictly controlled by the priesthood, who brew potions that induce pregnancy and can even determine the gender of the child. Oh, and I'm pretty sure Amazonians are immortal, only dying from physical means. Lately, more and more expeditions by researchers have set sails to contact tribes of Amazonians as rumors began to spread of them dying out due to a low population.
If you are forced to defend yourself against an ostrich, avoid close quarters combat.
Culkins are large carnivorous flightless birds that roam the plains south of the Lizardman Temple city of Oxel. They're, ostriches. They're used as mounts for skinks and Amazonian warriors for cavalry in battle. While not exactly the same, in Age of Sigmar they released the Rapidon unit, which does look similar. The Cavalcade of Nurgle, or simply the Carnival of Nurgle, is a traveling band of circus performers and demons that travel the rural countryside of the old world, leaving a wake of death and decay in its tracks. Some believe this carnival started out as a band of wandering peasants that traveled to villages to perform entertaining shows for the poor folk, and somehow along its travels was corrupted by the plague god Nurgle. When the carnival enters the town, is under an illusionary spell that hides their decaying flesh and horrendous mutations. It's only during the final act of the show does the spell wear off, revealing their true nature to the onlookers. Anyone who didn't collapse from the rampant disease is kidnapped to join the circus, leaving the village completely picked clean and abandoned.
Hey everybody, Kermit here.
The Slann are in 40k, but they haven't been explicitly mentioned since 1st edition. They claim to be the oldest intelligent race in the galaxy, with the height of their empire being millions of years before the current setting. They carved a great empire for themselves in the stars, and nurtured many races and encouraged evolution in many civilizations, including the Eldar, Orcs, Necrontyr, and even humans. The Slann, just like their fantasy counterparts, are very aware of the Chaos Gods, and even warned the Eldar of the birth of Slaanesh should the Eldar keep carrying on as they were.
Excusez-moi, I find you to be quite riveting. For you, mon cœur.
The Slann have completely retired from galactic affairs, residing in the galactic north. There are no records of wars or disasters, they simply quit. It's rumored that they are experimenting with spiritual life forces and alternate realities. Considering they already know the nature of the warp, I suspect these might be other realities outside of both the material and immaterial realm. As I said, they weren't mentioned since 1st edition and were stand-ins for what would later be known as the Old Ones in modern lore, that created all the races we see in 40k today. However, there is art of Slann in the 4th edition rulebook, so maybe they really are out there. If there is a swastika in the 1st edition rulebook, I can't find it. There are several runes and talismans art that look Nazi adjacent, but nothing that's specifically a swastika. Earlier Warhammer 40k has a lot of references to Nazi iconography, such as the old orc storm boys with SS looking hats and symbols. Old 2nd edition orcs were a little bit more Nazi flavored than they are today. Now today they're just British soccer fans.
Come on, England!
Oh, and this banner has a swastika. Kinda. Siberians were only mentioned in 1st edition as folk that lived in the harsh taiga north of Kislev, mostly living off hunting animals and selling their fur to Kislev and empire merchants to the south. They've never been mentioned again, and I believe they've been replaced with the Gospodars, which were a nomadic people from the eastern steppes that basically established the kingdom of Kislev. Long story short.
What the hell? Oh my god!
I don't even know what to say about this entry. These models were made in the 80s and were mentioned as late as 6th edition in 2000. Look, I've always thought an African culture's faction would be cool, something akin to the Zulu, Mali, Ethiopia, something, but this ain't it. Even in the lore, they're referred to as lesser men by in-universe scholars, which, yeah, this is a yikes out of 10 for me. Not even going to touch on this one.
I'm French! Why do you think I have this outrageous accent, you silly king?
Warmaster is already a niche game system, and the Bretonnian army is even nicher. Is that even a word? These were only ever sold through mail order, making them much rarer than the other armies that were actually sold in shops. They're not exactly hard to find online, although a little pricey.
Whom do you serve? Saruman.
I think this entry is lying to me. Going as far back as the release of 1st edition Lord of the Rings, I couldn't find an orc model that looked like Warhammer orcs. Unless I'm missing something, this is another entry I'll have to admit defeat on. If you know where I can find what this entry is talking about, please leave in the comments below and appease the almighty YouTube algorithm.
This guy has an entire frog army and it's wild. This may even be the kid who accidentally breeded 1.4 million of them in his backyard.
Back in Warhammer Fantasy 3rd edition, the Slann and the Lizardmen were two different factions. I'm going to be honest, when we talked about Culkins a few weeks back, I figured there would be many more references as Aztec gods, but all I could find was the same information as back then. Just a one-off throwaway line about the Slann god Quetzalcoatl.
Oh, I suppose we need to find some heretical idols to make this thing surrender its prize.
Over on the Collecting Citadel Miniatures wiki page, they cataloged a large collection of unreleased Warhammer minis. It's a blast to scroll through these and see some of the ideas early designers had, such as this dwarf dressed in a Turkish Janissary uniform. But they don't only have fantasy, they also have 40k, Rogue Trader, Lord of the Rings, and much more. I would check it out.
Had soiled hands. Maybe he had urine. Maybe he did not wash. Maybe. And maybe your parents are not your biological parents.
I wouldn't say Islam was once canon, but still kind of is, but also never was. In Araby, the vast majority of the population worship the one true God, or Allah. Now, Allah is just the Arabic word for God, so to say Islam is canon just because they use the word Allah is, in my opinion, not enough.
مرحبا وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الشيخ اليوم بالغلط وقع في تمي شاورما مع زيادة طحينية.
نعم.
وكمان قطعة تفاح وتقريبا 3 لتر مي. فمش عارف هل أكمل صيامي ولا أطعمني الله وسقاني.
And that's pretty much where the connections stop. It's a monotheistic religion with scriptures that are taken very seriously by both the common people of Araby and sultans. It says that Allah tends to frown on luxury. Not really sure what that entails, but interestingly, Allah's priests and prophets can bind demons to brass bottles and leave them buried beneath the sand.
To the Sigmas of Australia, I say that this goofy-air government have been capping. Not just now, but for a long time.
Lumbria is only ever mentioned in a world map released in 2004. East of Nippon is an arrow that reads Fabled Lumbria. Lemuria might be the same landmass, but again, it's not exactly clear. We know almost next to nothing about Nippon and even less about Lumbria. However, some speculate that it's supposed to represent fantasy Australia. Perhaps Lumbria and Lumeria is Australia and New Zealand.
They're capaholics. They're also yapaholics. They yap non-stop about how their cost of living measures are changing lives for all Australians. Just put the fries in the bag, little bro. They tell us that they're locked in. In Total War Warhammer 3, you can get an item called the Jade Blade of the Great Fleet, which is said to be fashioned from a sea creature from Lumbria.
I hate to break this to you, but your mother is what we Native Americans refer to as Bear with Wide Canyon.
What do you mean?
Your mom's a slut.
The Skrilline are the native human population in Naggaroth that existed before the Great Sundering and the Dark Elves arrived in Naggaroth. They divided themselves into various tribes called the Redfoot, Tapok, and the Watamok. They are now long gone, either being enslaved by the Dark Elf colonizers or assimilating with Norscan tribes. What's cool is the Skrilline are what the Vikings that landed in Canada called the natives there in real history. The Thunder Lizard is another species of dinosaur that roam Lustria and one of the largest. Being based off the real-world Brontosaurus, the Lizardmen have learned how to deal with these creatures after one of them destroyed a district in the temple city of Zlanhupek. These beasts are massive, with their long necks reaching above the thick jungle canopy. When a Thunder Lizard is spotted, messengers are sent to the nearest temple city to warn them of the incoming Thunder Lizard, but they are far and few between as they have a very small population. Now, where the toy dinosaur army list comes in, I believe it's because there are no official artwork or miniatures of the Thunder Lizard. And in Warhammer Chronicles 2004, Phil Kelly used various non-Warhammer dinosaur children toys to represent a lizardman army from the Dragon Isles, including a toy Ankylosaurus to represent a thunder lizard, which, no, that's not it, Phil.
Excuse me, do you know how to get to town?
Yeah, it's back the way you came.
The Slann are a race of humanoid frog people in the D&D universe. Their society is built upon a caste system based on the color of their hide. There's a whole bunch of lore about them living in the Outer Planes and how there are different species of them, but we don't care about any of that. We only care about the Warhammer connections. The Slann first made an appearance in the White Dwarf magazine published by Games Workshop in the 80s. In an attempt to sell off overstock Slann minis, Games Workshop created the Slann faction, which, as previously discussed, was a different faction from the Lizardmen. The Slann and the Lizardmen would later be combined in the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this iceberg, there was an entry about how Warhammer came about from Games Workshop just trying to sell off more D&D miniatures. This information comes from the Warhammer Fantasy fandom wiki, but it has no source, so I cannot verify any of this. As I said in the early entry, I cannot find where the sentiment comes from, only because Games Workshop in the 80s needed to move more stock, so take everything in this entry with a grain of salt. Take a look at this map. Looks like a drunk toddler tried to draw the Earth, huh? So we have Europe and Africa, and this must be North and South America. Now, who inhabits North America? That's right, the Dark Elves. And what form of institution does the Dark Elf economy rely on? I think you see where this is going. Yes, the enslaving Druchi inhabit the fantasy North America, drove off the local natives, centered their economy around slave labor, and are currently in a bloody civil war, just like the United States in the mid-1800s. Until Sherman had a nice stroll through Georgia or something, I don't know.
Being poo-poo in here. No, seriously, why does it smell like caca and wee-whiz in here?
Nurgle was an ancient deity that was worshipped in Mesopotamia, and was associated with a wide range of things like the underworld, death, destruction, war, but also pestilence. Yeah, he wasn't exactly a nice god to hang out with. The connections of Nurgle are pretty obvious. They both deal with disease, plagues, and decay, and while Nurgle isn't associated with just death, he does represent the cycle of life, from birth to death.
Why are you f***ing here, man? You're so old. Where's your wife? Go home to your family, dude.
Imagine it. You're in 1978. You're living in a time of historical significance. The Jamestown Massacre. Whew, scary. The birth of the first IVF baby. Aww. Pope John II is elected. He walks out on his balcony in his Dark Souls 3 drip and announces to the world,
"Yo, this Reaper wargame is pretty fucking good."
The Reaper Fantasy Wargame rules came out in 1978, around the same time as Dungeons & Dragons, and a few years after Games Workshop was founded. While it never reached the popularity of Warhammer, it's still pretty groundbreaking. Unlike Warhammer, which focuses on large-scale battles, Reaper was more like a skirmish game with really complex rules. It even recommended using a game master to help things run smoothly, set objectives, and build a story around the battle. So it was a bit like a mix of D&D and a war game.
But these are the rules that were the forerunner for Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Essentially, the war, sort of like the war game with role-playing sort of like aspects that would be the forerunner not only to essentially all the subsequent iterations of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, but out of that would come Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
If you read through the rules, they feel oddly familiar to Warhammer as we know it today. The phases for movement, shooting, combat, and even morale tests were all there. Although a morale eventually got scrapped in Age of Sigmar, which personally I don't mind because morale was always a boring mechanic. What's really interesting about Reaper isn't how to play it, but how it helped show that there was a real market for fantasy wargaming in the early 80s. Even though Reaper never saw the same success as Warhammer, it set the groundwork for a hobby we love today, and we will never forget that.
Vote for me President of the United States. I am Brent Peterson.
Yeah, duh, this entry is so dumb. We had a whole discussion about the deep cut Thatcher jokes, and the entire setting of Warhammer 40k is poking fun of an absurdly authoritarian dying fascist regime that plunged the entire Milky Way galaxy into an endless war, with unimaginable levels of suffering for both humans and aliens. And Warhammer Fantasy highlights the flaws of a feudal system like the Holy Roman Empire, where a random elector count sends thousands to die because he wanted to collect taxes in Pig Shitburg or something. Warhammer is inherently political. That said, playing Warhammer isn't some bold political statement either. I just hate this entry.
What about breakfast?
We've already had it.
We've had one, yes. What about second breakfast?
Now this is a deep cut. I guess there was a Warmaster demo at Games Day in 2003 that involved a Lizardman army, as well as a small regiment of jungle-themed halflings.
Ja pierdolę, jakie bydle! Bober!
Władcy much
is a Polish comedy cartoon and is sometimes referred to as the Polish South Park. It aired from 2006 to November 2011 and blah 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 blah. Look, it's a Polish TV show. There were no examples when I tried googling these Warhammer references. If they're out there, please leave a link down below, but I don't have time to sit through 5 years of Polish TV to find a one-off joke. This level was tough, so here's a list of things I could not find at all. Sorry.
All right, head, your time is up.
Who you calling head?
On the Collecting Citadel Miniatures wiki and the unreleased model section, you can find not one, but 2 Beastmen models with penises on their head.
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
This is a fan theory that basically turns around the idea that the Warhammer fantasy world is in 40k, and just says the entirety of the 40k universe is inside a wizard's crystal ball, and this is based on no sources and just vibes.
You're barely worth eating, shorty, so get talking.
Supposedly on the mythical lands of Lemuria, there are giant pygmies that sometimes fight with the ogres, but look, all I gotta say is thank God GW didn't try to make a model of one.
2 steps ahead. I am always 2 steps ahead.
This is both a fan theory and just a true statement. Yeah, AOS was probably planned when the End Time books were released. I really doubt they blew up Warhammer Fantasy without some sort of backup. Now, after reading some of the rules of AOS First Edition and how the game just told you to bring all your models and not to worry about points, it really does seem like AOS wasn't planned very well. But what this entry may be saying is that Age of Sigmar was planned from the very beginning, and yeah, maybe. I'm sure GW has some sort of plan to blow up 40k and replace it with something once 40k isn't profitable anymore. This project started in late December of last year, and it feels really great finally getting it done. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Thanks again everyone for checking out my Fallout video I posted a few weeks ago. For the new viewers coming in, I have some questions for you, if you're still watching that is. What kind of content are you looking for? I plan to do more Warhammer stuff like painting tutorials, battle reports, and sometimes some lore, but would you guys be interested in long form content like hour-plus long lore videos, or should I just keep it a mix? Should I stick to Warhammer, or would you guys prefer a mix of things I just find interesting? Please let me know what you think down below, and once again, thank you so much for watching. It really does mean a lot.